Welcome back, friends. For those tuning in for the first time, my name is Jasmine and I watch a shit ton of TV. I recently tuned into the 2025 BET Awards and let me tell you, I was living for the nostalgia. They brought out Free. It was so good to see Free, Terrence, and other 106 & Park hosts from different eras. We got performances from B2K, Ashanti, A-Marie, who quickly redeemed herself from her Tiny Desk fail, and Mr. 106 & Park himself, Bow Wow. This was my first time tuning into the BET Awards in a while, and to be honest, I did it just for the nostalgia. And judging off of social media, that's what a lot of other millennials tuned in for as well. But it got me to thinking, there was a time when BET was the place for Black entertainment and media, and I used to dream of working there. I would rush home after school to watch 106 & Park, and I genuinely loved so many other shows on the network. But these days, BET is often a punchline when people talk about the state of Black media. And that made me want to explore how we got here. How a network that once held so much cultural power seemingly lost its footing. So in this video, I'm going to break it down by era. The public service era, the golden era, the transition era, the syndication and safe bets era, the Tyler Perry / BET Plus era, and finally, the what now era. And let me be clear, this is a shallow dive, not a deep dive, because it's not a full-on academic thesis. It's just enough to get our hair wet and talk about this in a way that is still meaningful. And this won't cover everything. There's a way too much history to pack into one video. But I wanted to hit the moments that mattered most to me. And just so we're on the same page, this also isn't a hit piece. I still respect BET, and I firmly believe that it can become the cultural destination once again. But we do have to be honest about what's not working. Welcome to Shallow Dive. Where does BET go from here? Let's start with the time between the 1980s and the mid-1990s, or what I like to call the public service era. When BET first launched in 1980, it was a game changer. This was the first cable network specifically created for Black audiences, and it didn't just focus on entertainment. BET was originally rooted in information, education, and representation. BET was founded by Robert L. Johnson in 1980, who maintained ownership during this era. It was Black-owned and independently operated, which is part of why the programming leans heavily into empowerment, education, and culturally specific storytelling. We're talking about shows like Teen Summit, which tackled issues like peer pressure, racism, relationships, and drug use from a teen perspective. We also had BET News and BET Nightly News, which covered stories that mainstream media either ignored or mishandled. We had Lift Every Voice, which was a faith-based talk show highlighting spirituality and positivity. We even had Bobby Jones Gospel, which brought gospel music to national TV screens every week for decades. In the 80s and early 90s, Black media was still extremely limited. There weren't many places we could go to see ourselves in nuanced or affirming ways outside of sitcoms or music videos. It gave us content that centered on the Black experience without so much trauma as the hook. There was a real effort to inform and uplift, like a media ministry and cultural classroom wrapped into one. This era of BET wasn't flashy or viral, but it was essential. It helped shape how Black youth, communities, and families saw themselves and each other. It was clear back then that BET had a mission. The question is, how long would that mission last? Now let's get into what I and a lot of millennials consider the golden era of BET. This was a time between the mid-90s and the mid-2000s. This was the time. Even just thinking about it, I can't stop the smile from stretching across my face. BET was such a vibe during this moment. The energy was everywhere, and if you grew up during this time watching BET, you knew that it wasn't just a network, it was a lifestyle. In 2000, BET was acquired by Viacom, but Robert L. Johnson remained CEO until 2005. So during this era, you still felt the original spirit of the network, even as the corporate influence started to creep in. There was a lot more budget, more polish, and BET was trying to keep up with competitors like MTV while staying culturally specific. I loved both BET and MTV, honestly. I loved TRL so much. When I was in 5th grade, my elementary school took like this East Coast tour, and one of the places that we stopped in was New York City, of course. And I remember walking through Times Square and looking up and seeing seeing exactly where they shot TRL. And I said, I'm going to live here one day. And of course, I ended up doing so. And so I won't deny the impact that MTV had on me, but I also can't deny the relatability factor when I watched BET. We had shows like 106 & Park with Free and AJ. Look, I mentioned that at the top of the video. That goes down as one of the all-time greatest shows, greatest moments in pop culture history. 106 & Park was so amazing. The Free and AJ era, obviously that was the classic era, but I can't lie, I also really enjoyed Terrence and Roxy. 106 & Park was like the blacker, cooler TRL. We also had Access Granted, which was like BET's version of Making the Video. We had College Hill, which was The Real World, but with HBCUs. How I'm Living, which was BET's version of MTV Cribs, but with exclusively Black celebrities. And of course, Spring Bling, which was BET's answer to MTV's Spring Break. One of my other favorite shows was ComicView. I remember watching this late at night when I should have been getting ready for bed, but instead I wanted to watch ComicView. This show was essential. It was one of the only nationally televised platforms for Black comedians, and it helped launch the career of people like Kevin Hart, Samore, and Cedric the Entertainer. And how could I forget Notarized, which was the yearly countdown that had me seated every New Year. I vividly remember watching this with my sister in 1999, and I don't know why it scared me that we were like doing a countdown, because I thought the world was going to end in the year 2000, and so like Notarized counting down all of the videos, I was just like, no, they're counting down till the end of the world. I know. I was like in elementary school at this time. But while we're talking about the cultural events that happened during this era, we cannot forget to mention the reason you're even watching this video today, and that is the birth of the BET Awards. Launched in 2001, the BET Awards quickly became the most important night in Black entertainment. It was so much more than just a show. The BET Awards helped solidify BET as a cultural force. And of course, there are certain BET moments that are just burned into my memory. I'll never forget when Monique hosted and she did her opening number, which was a full-on choreographed moment to Crazy in Love, including the costumes. I also remember when Destiny's Child performed Cater to You, and they had Magic Johnson, Nelly, and Terrence Howard on stage, and Terrence Howard was doing his finest acting work. Beyonce performed Deja Vu live for the first time on the BET Awards, and I'll also never forget watching Michael Jackson and James Brown on stage with each other. The BET Awards were a defining moment in the brand's history, and it gave us so many moments that we still talk about today. This was also the era when BET started to dabble into docu-style reality shows. I remember watching Keisha Cole, The Way It Is, Lil' Kim's Countdown to Lockdown, and they also had one centered around DMX called DMX Soul of a Man. These are all raw, emotional, and honest stories that covered celebrities in a way that felt really familiar. And we cannot talk about this era without talking about the original AI baddie herself, Cita's World. But in this era, there was also some unfortunate cuts that were made, and I'm talking mostly about Midnight Love and the infamous BET Uncut. Uncut was definitely controversial, and if I'm being honest, I probably shouldn't have been watching it as a child, so as an adult, I completely understand why they would want it off the air. It made sense, but at the time, it did feel like one of those shows that could have only existed on BET. And then of course, Midnight Love, that one really hurt because I felt like it was one of the few spaces on TV that truly gave slow jams and Quiet Storm energy a home. It was soft, sexy, and grown, probably too grown for me at the time. But this was BET's most impactful phase for millennials. These shows raised us and helped define our taste in music, style, how we viewed fame, relationships, and even college. BET didn't just mirror what was happening on MTV. They took it and they made it relatable and iconic for us. This was peak cultural curation. Were we being entertained? Yes, but we were also being seen. Now we're entering what I call the transition era, and this is a time between the mid-2000s and early 2010s. During this era, BET definitely still had us locked in, but if you paid close enough attention, you could start to sense that things were slowly changing. But let's start with the good, because there was a lot of it. This era gave us the Being Mary Jane. Gabrielle Union was so good. She was so layered as Mary Jane, and I wanted to see so much more. Super fun fact, I was actually an extra on this show. So yes, my love runs deep for Being Mary Jane. BET BET also picked up and reimagined the show The Game, which was originally on the CW network. But there are some people who don't even realize that this show started on the CW because BET took it and really made it its own. And one of the most clever shows that they had during this time was The Real Husbands of Hollywood. I thought that show was extremely funny, extremely clever, and very timely. It was created by Kevin Hart, and it starred him, Nick Cannon, Boris Kodjoe, Robin Thicke, and Dwayne Martin. It was super funny and self-aware in a way that I hadn't seen BET do before. And on the reality TV stars, they kept pumping out really good shows, including Baldwin Hills, Frankie and Neffy, and Tiny and Toya. But one of the greatest unscripted shows that came out of this era was hands down the Monique show. Monique belongs on a talk show. She needs to take over the reins of one of these daytime shows and get some of these other girlies out of here. She was super in her element when she was hosting the show, and I want to see her in that capacity again. I also can't end this era without talking about Hell Date. I don't even know what to say about that show, except for if you know, you know. There was a little person dressed as a devil with a little pitchfork who will run out at the end of these dates. It was completely unhinged, but I think about it a lot. Tyler James Williams actually just brought that up when he presented at the 2025 BET Awards, so I know it's something that people still think about periodically, whether you want to forget it or not. BET was kind of in a try anything phase, and sometimes it really worked, and sometimes it was Hell Date. But here's the thing, while the content was still strong, you could feel a change in the air. The vibe just started to feel different during this time, and the programming didn't always feel super cohesive. The network was evolving, but we weren't sure exactly where it was going. And behind the scenes, big changes were happening too. Viacom is deep into their acquisition of BET, and the corporate fingerprints were starting to show. Around this time, Deborah Lee officially became chairwoman and CEO, taking over for Robert L. Johnson. She had already been a major part of BET because she served as president and COO since the 90s, so her promotion felt like a natural next step. But under her leadership, BET became more polished and more structured, and some would argue more cautious. The soul wasn't completely gone yet, but something was looming. Now, between the years 2014 and 2018, I like to call this the syndication and safe bets era, and it was a little frustrating. To be clear, BET still had a few solid wins during this time, and I'm talking about Tales, which was created by the late great Irv Gotti, which took popular hip-hop songs and turned them into mini movies. And then they also had huge wins back-to-back with the Bobby Brown story and the New Edition story, which they killed with the casting and the storytelling. But if I'm being honest, I wasn't watching much else during this time. He had shows like The Gary Owen Show and The Westbrooks, which I really didn't find myself interested in. And I know some people really enjoyed shows like Chasing Destiny and Hit the Floor, but I never really got into them, and so I can't say if they were actually good or not. To me, the programming didn't feel as connected to my life anymore, and the network stopped feeling like it was making bold creative decisions. It felt risk averse, like they didn't want to take any chances unless a big celebrity name was attached to it or it was cheap to produce. This is why reruns became a staple on the network. I'm talking, of course, Baby Boy, which became a meme because of how much BET played it. And you would regularly catch reruns of The Parkers, Martin, and older sitcoms like The Cosby Show. Even though BET had already started to syndicate these shows in the early 2000s, they became more dominant as original programming started to slow down. From an ownership standpoint, Viacom was fully at the reins, and Deborah Lee was comfortably in her seat as CEO, but she was now under full corporate oversight. BET had become part of a much larger machine, and you could totally feel it. To add some cultural context to this era, this was also when viewer habits were starting to change big time. We were watching less live TV and more streaming. Platforms like Netflix, Hulu, and YouTube were dominating at this point because people wanted content on demand. Social media was also where the culture was shifting because algorithms and virality started to matter so much more. And in my opinion, instead of innovating and carving out a digital-first strategy, BET kept going down the rerun route. They leaned heavily on syndicated shows and safe, celebrity-focused reality TV. It felt like the network was scared to experiment during this time, and because of that, they started to fade into the background. Culturally, it was no longer the place to be. And that's where the frustration really started to kick in, because we knew what BET could be, because we'd seen it. But this era felt like watching an iconic brand slowly become a shadow of itself. We now enter the years between 2019 and 2022, which I call the Tyler Perry and BET Plus era. This was going to be a bit of a balancing act. There's no denying that Tyler Perry helped save BET in a lot of ways. He brought consistent content and ratings, and when BET Plus launched in 2019, he was the face of the brand. The streamer was pretty much built on his catalog. But that being said, a lot of us started to feel the creative fatigue. BET went all in on one voice, one tone, one style, one band, one sound. And while I have immense respect for Tyler Perry's hustle, the lack of variety is hard to ignore. Not every show felt fully developed. Some felt like they completely skipped the writer's room, which Tyler Perry famously does not use a writer's room, so I guess that is on track. But as a viewer who grew up during BET's most iconic years, it felt disappointing to see the brand become so homogenous. That said, it's also fair to acknowledge that Tyler Perry had some huge hits on the network like Sisters and The Oval. Those shows have loyal viewers, especially in the Southern Black audiences, and it's kept BET's scripted slate alive in a way that a lot of other networks haven't been able to maintain. So while it might not be my cup of tea, I can't act like the impact isn't there. This era followed the departure of Deborah Lee in 2018. Around this time, Stephen Hill, who has served as the president of programming and was instrumental in shows like 106 & Park and the BET Awards, also exited the company. And with Scott Mills stepping in as president and eventually CEO, the path forward was pretty clear. There was a Viacom-CBS merger looming, and the strategy became just keep the lights on and let Tyler Perry run the show, literally. And still, there were gems during this era, and I absolutely have to give credit where credit is due. One of my favorite shows to come out of this era was BET Presents The Encore. It was such a creative concept. Take former girl group members and solo singers, put them in a house, and challenge them to form a brand new group together. And the magic that we got out of that was a group called Blueprint, and I still listen to their music to this day. The show was executive produced and created by my friend Carlos King, and I always will give Carlos flowers. Fun fact, if it wasn't for BET Presents The Encore, I don't know if Carlos's podcast, Reality with the King, would exist in the same way that it exists now. Of course, I know he would have found his way to podcasting and YouTubing, but that show is actually what prompted me to reach out to him and pitch the idea of him starting a podcast with SiriusXM with me as the executive producer. So even in a creatively frustrating era, BET still played a role in shaping new paths, mine included. I also want to show some love to Bigger, Justice for Bigger. That was one of the better scripted shows that I've seen on BET in a long time as well. And I also want to shout out 20s. I mentioned Irv Gotti earlier in this video when I talked about his show Tales, but we also got the documentary, The Murder Inc. Story, and I have looked up to Irv Gotti for so long, so watching the Murder Inc. Story was so cool to just hear more about his journey. Even though he's a great storyteller and he has told stories about the origins of Murder Inc., I really enjoyed watching it, and I thought it was really smart for BET to do a special like that. So rest in peace, Irv. For some cultural context during this era, the streaming wars are now in full effect. Black creators are now starting to get opportunities on platforms like Netflix, Hulu, and Prime Video. Shows like Insecure, Black AF, and Harlem were expanding the image of what Black TV could be. Then you had social media and YouTube creating new stars, and still BET was nowhere to be found in this conversation. Because BET Plus never really felt like it had strong brand identity. It wasn't a culture driver, and most people couldn't tell you what was going on with the catalog unless they were a huge Tyler Perry fan or they knew one or two titles. And because it was so Tyler Perry dominated, other voices on the streamer never really got a chance to shine. Which was sad because there was opportunity and there was clearly a budget, but there was just a serious lack of creative diversity. This era was important, but it was also very predictable. And this was a time that BET really started to just coast as a brand. So here we are today in the what now era. These are the years from 2023 to present. And BET still means something to most of us. The brand has history and it holds weight, but the biggest question is, what does BET actually do now? It exists in a digital world, but it doesn't feel like it's evolved like the viewers have evolved. We're living in a time where Black creators are building empires across YouTube, TikTok, Twitch, and other streaming platforms, and BET, the network that once defined what was cool, hasn't figured out to show up in any of those places in a meaningful way. Let's talk about the missed podcast opportunity. opportunity. BET should have had their own podcasting channel by now. They should have companion podcasts, docu-style audio series, and branded shows that build off of their legacy. There's so much IP just sitting there and nothing. And I say the part about podcasts with some personal frustration because I've personally emailed Scott Mills, the current CEO of BET, multiple times about what BET podcasts could look like and how to create something that is truly culture shifting, but he left me on red each time. And I think that's the part that stings a little bit because the opportunity is right there. And I'm literally trying to say, hey, I can help you do this. We can also talk about streaming. Kai Cenat, who is one of the most popular streamers, streamed the entire BET Awards to his audience. He has the Gen Z audience that BET should be courting, and I don't really see real plans to do that. In terms of other programming, BET should be tapping into the dating show craze. They should have lifestyle and home content. They could tap into travel stories. There's so much out there that could really keep their audience engaged, but it's just reruns, reboots, and Tyler Perry. And I'm not being disrespectful at all. I'm just reflecting and hoping for a redirection. Because despite everything I said, I still believe in BET. There is no other brand that has a cultural footprint, the name power, and the emotional connection with Black audiences like BET does. But to get back to being the cultural leader that it once was, BET has to let go of the fear. It has to let go of the lack of creative diversity, and it has to stop clinging to old formulas. They need to start asking, who are we serving now and how do we want to be remembered? The legacy is there and the future is wide open. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.